Hello, this is Justin Matthew. Welcome back to Second Nature. And today we are exploring a fascinating area of research, oral environmental history. This field asks a simple but a powerful question. How do people remember, narrate, and make meaning of their environments? And what happens when we turn these memories into historical knowledge? So we will look at how memory, storytelling, sounds, sense, and even human agencies help us reconstruct past environments. And today's lecture, this discussion is based on some of the seminal interventions in oral environmental history. They include Donald Wooster's The Dust Bowl, The Southern Plain in the 1930s, and William Cronon's seminal work, A Place for Stories, Nature, History and Narrative, Stephen Solon and Mark Cave's Oral History and the Environment, Global Perspective on Climate, Connections and Catastrophe, Kate Holmes and Heather Goodall's very well received work, Telling Environmental Histories, Intersections of Memory, Narrative and Environment. Then we have another major intervention by Daniela Endrese, Environmental Oral History, and in the Indian context, a very well noticed work by Amita, Baviskar, Uncivil City, Ecology, Equity, and the Commons in Delhi. In India, environmental history practiced by anthropologists, sociologists, and ecologists depend a lot on oral sources, interviews, memories. Now, historians also need to intervene in this field to make history, environmental history, an interdisciplinary field. I'm already an interdisciplinary field, and make it a much more deeper in terms of our engagements with social history, environmental history, and oral history approaches. So today's lecture, we are going to explore that intersection between environmental history and oral history with a clear purpose to make a case for social history engagement, or how memories, narrative are shaped by ongoing emotions, feelings, fear, and hope. And we also need to explore narrative forms. That is how historians should problematize the nature of memory, storytelling, or the interviews. Because, in Indian context, we have a strong tradition of, say, for instance, documentaries or oral interviews to record how people remember their environment, their surroundings. And how do we make use of those documents, interviews, structured interviews, and documentaries as an important archive for historical analysis? So let's explore that. So first, let's explore why oral environmental history matters. Donald Wooster, a well-known environmental historian, once aptly mentioned that environmental history is an attempt to understand how entire culture perceived and valued nature. Not just elites, not just written archives, but how ordinary people and their everyday environmental experiences and relationships shape a society and their experience. And why oral environmental history matters? Because, number one, social relations are inseparable from the environment that sustain them. Because people don't just live in environments, they live through them. Their livelihood, emotions, and identities are shaped by land, water, forest, animals, rhythms of monsoon, weather. So take, for example, life of fisherman community. Their everyday life is shaped by tides and monsoons, winds, also influenced by fish migration pattern, also gendered nature of fishing as a labor. Their life is equally influenced by cyclones and machine trolling. Their everyday conflict with machine trolling, fishing, shape their daily life. That and seas, for instance, another example, seas shore erosion shape their collective solidarity, new forms of protest. So that's how they live their life. But at the same time, bureaucratic documents rarely show how these ordinary people felt or experienced environmental crisis. So therefore, oral environmental history help historians to address these gaps in archives. Number two, when we come to South Asian context, oral history help us to revise colonial environmental narratives. I would say decolonization perspective. We know that colonial archives are often incomplete. They are racist, and they are focusing on extractive geographies and interventions. Oral testimonies recover local knowledge, indigenous environmental practices, and the lived impact of colonial resource extraction in the form of tea plantations or cotton plantation or railway and many other infrastructural development projects. So therefore, oral environmental history offers an alternative epistemology. That means we integrate indigenous, subaltern, pastoral, or fishing communities' perspective and their ecological knowledge. That would allow us to challenge state science and colonial categories, the so-called expert domain. Number three, oral environmental history allows us to integrate local and regional stories, ecological knowledge, and memories, and provide them a global dimension. This is what Sloan and Kev called the environmental entanglement of memory. The idea that remembering is always tied to landscape, seasons, rivers, crops, and even smell and sounds. That's how human societies are constituted, shaped, and shaping. And this also allows us to integrate emotional and subjective dimensions to our study, because memories capture fear, grief, nostalgia, hope, what William Cronon would call emotional architecture of environmental storytelling. To focus on that aspect, Holmes and Goodall reminds us that environmental history is not only about nature. It is equally about storytelling. How people tell environmental stories and what they value and what they fear and how they imagine injustice happen to them. People's narrative or people narrate how they survived a flood or drought, or how they encountered or had conflict with animals. There are many such instances. For instance, when you go for oral interviews, people would tell you how, or villagers would describe a river before dam building. Or women may remember droughts and how they survived. Or tribal communities remember forest and deforestation. People also experience pollution. For instance, Delhi's context or North Indian context, largely we remember year after year, density of pollution, and people also remember displacement or climate anxiety. So all these, this is where oral history and its intersection with environmental history is indispensable. Now coming to doing environmental history, there are three scales of doing oral environmental history. If I largely borrow from Daniela Endrese, they are: number one, knowledge. Oral testimonies offer place-based knowledge about past environments that include soil fertility, rainfall patterns, or fish migration, local plant varieties, animal behavior, and so on, right? So these memories form what anthropologists would call the ecological knowledge archive, something that we require for our environmental history analysis. And second scale is practice. People are not passive observers of nature. They're active participants. Therefore, oral accounts show how farmers cultivate their land, how fishers read rivers and monsoon wind, or pastoralists track seasonal change or glaciation, and how rural or urban poor women gather a source of energy, how they cook food, manage water resources. Holmes and Goodall demonstrate how practices create environmental memory, practices like these. Because the body remember landscape even when archive fails to, or remain silent. Third scale is power. This scale is crucial because, social hierarchies that include caste, gender, nationality, ethnicity, coloniality, all these social contradictions shape not just experiences, but what is tellable and what is silenced. William Cronon warns us that every narrative includes and excludes, empowering some voices and while marginalizing others. There are silenced voices, and there are stories told and stories untold. So therefore, oral environmental historians must ask, whose knowledge counts as environmental knowledge? Should we consider an indigenous tribal person as informant or as an expert? Who is allowed to speak for rivers, mountains, or other ecosystems or landscapes? Only experts are allowed, or can indigenous people, the so-called informants, speak? Who benefits when environmental decline stories justify state control, state dominance, and export interventions? So William Cronon in this context would tell us that the very boundary between natural and artificial is political. And when we write environmental history, we need to be critical, reflexive about this power element of storytelling. Now come to environmental history as a practice. That's why we phrase it doing environmental history, doing oral environmental history, not studying oral environmental history. Or put it in a different way, oral environmental history is more than a method. It's an ethical practice. Why ethical practice? Because it foregrounds uneven human environmental relationships. In Western environmental history, if you carefully see, there is a tendency to decenter a human as a collective, and try to give voices to non-human animals. That's important, but at the same time, it's very important to think about racism, caste discrimination, colonial dispossession, gendered labor. All these shape how people access land, water, and forest, and all other ecological resources. Second, it reconnects environmental history to labor history, especially in global peripheral context. This is oral environmental history is extremely crucial to write labor history, because workers, peasants, fishers, forest dwellers, and all other people live by, depend directly on natural nature, carry memories of extraction, exploitation, and ecological change close to their heart. And third, it engages environmental oral history as a practice, engages grassroots environmental justice movements. Here, if I quote from Sloan and Cave, oral environmental history amplifies the voice of communities those who fighting for their survival, those who fight against mining, dams, pollution, or landfill, or climate change, and many other issues. So it reminds us that environmental history is not simply about what happened. It is about who gets to narrate what happened. There is our responsibility as environmental historian to document past environment. So let's look at some of thematic areas where oral history have transformed our understanding of their environment. One sector could be environmental knowledge, because oral history, oral historians or oral histories preserve knowledge of seed or soil, birds, rivers, monsoon, and any other ecological specificities. Because knowledge, it's important to preserve knowledge in the age of urbanization, planetary urbanization, because knowledge threatened by urbanization, monoculture, and industrial pollution is extremely important. And second, we can preserve a voice of wild, non-human nature. We are referring to animal history. For instance, in Indian context, if you go to Western Ghats, villagers narrate elephant migration, their conflict with elephants. If you go to eastern or western coastal region, fishers remember fish behavior, fish migration, or consider Himalayas, lower Himalayas or upper Himalayas. Pastoralist recounting predator livestock interactions. So, such accounts challenge human-centric narratives. Now come to ecosystem specificities like river voice. River voices can be recorded because communities living by rivers remember their traditional fishing techniques, biodiversity, and patterns of food and access to food, or a seasonal water quality change, and birds, turtle, fish, and other animal habitats. So these memories rebuild river histories that written archives rarely, or colonial archives rarely capture. Then we can write, similarly we can record food history and memory, or infrastructure and landscape change can also be an important field, a living field where oral accounts of dams, airports, mining, and all other infrastructural projects reveal stories of displacement, loss of livelihoods, and negotiations between intermediaries and local people and authorities, state authorities, and everyday experience of environmental modification, and experience of laborers, those who are engaged in these activities. So, these stories often challenge mainstream narratives of development. And we can also write oral histories of environmental justice. This is one of the crucial field we need to consider. So because oral historian can make case or provide a new language to oppose capitalistic appropriation of nature, what David Harvey would call accumulation by dispossession, that include anti-mining, anti-fracking movements, movement against land grabbing, or protest against privatization of water and forest. Fight against urban gentrification, redevelopment, and green space expropriation. So this movement. So now, finally, oral environmental history is extremely important to study the climate crisis, especially local experiences of climate change and mitigation, and how to address the crisis. Because, for instance, if you see coastal communities can narrate sea level rise and how it affects their daily life. Mountain dwellers describe glacier retreat, or farmers recalling shifting monsoon patterns and how it affects their agricultural knowledge and practices. So fishers observe declining fish stock and migration. So we need to make a case for participatory oral history to ensure that local voices guide adaptation strategies instead of being overshadowed by science and experts. In this context, once again, let me quote Holmes and Goodall. They would argue that climate stories reminds us that environmental history is also emotional history. Histories of fear, uncertainty, nostalgia, hope for all, but climate memory. So, to practice oral history is equally history. It's equally a practice of listening. Listen critically, ethically, and reflexively. Listen to humans, landscape, to animals, to memories, and even to silences. Because narrative is powerful, as William Cronon warns us. But listening with critical angle, perspective, can transform how we narrate and how we write the past and imagine a just environmental future. As William Cronon observed, every story we tell shape what counts as nature, what counts as history, and what counts as justice. And as Sloan and Cave, Holmes and Goodall reminds us, environmental storytelling is always collaborative. It connects people, places, and ecologies across generations, across regions. Thank you for listening. If you like to read further, a list of additional theoretical and case studies are given in the description. Feel free to comment below, and see you in the next video. Thank you.